Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. Mancus Public Library is thrilled to introduce Larry Grimes, who is a Hemingway scholar. Larry's a professor emeritus of English at the Grisham and in the Grisham Chair for Humanities at Bethany College, which is in West Virginia. He taught there for 39 years, chaired the Department of English for 25 years, and he also served as Dean of Arts and Sciences and Vice President and Dean of the faculty. He has a BA in English from Bethany. He has an MDiv in theology, excuse me, and culture from Yale Divinity School, a PhD in literature and theology, the Graduate Institute of the Liberal Arts, Emory University Doctor of Humanities, an honorary doctorate, Bethany College, a founding member of the Hemingway Society. He's authored and co-authored numerous books, which we have many of at the library, and written essays. Larry resides near Mancus, and when possible, he teases the trout, or he questions, is it they who tease him? Now, many of you probably saw the Ken Burns recent Hemingway documentary that was shown in April on PBS. And I think this has spurred a lot of interest in Hemingway. And we've seen that at the library. Now, Joan Didion, who is the columnist in her newest book, Let Me Tell You What I Mean, talks about Hemingway. And she says, we forget sometimes that this was a writer who had in his time made the English language new, changed the rhythms of the way both his own and the next few generations would speak and write and think. He was a man to whom words mattered. He worked at them, he understood them, and he got inside them. So Larry, you're going to tell us a little bit more about this man who got inside words.
I like the way you've started it because my interest in him is the words. The world's interest in has often been the man, the celebrity. And those two can get crosswise with each other. I think the reason he's still around is because of the words. As a man, I've said to people, I'm not sure I'd want to have dinner with him. But well, then again, it'd probably be a pretty interesting dinner.
I would think.
He's a very complicated man, and there's much I'd like to know. I think that Ken Burns and Lynn Novick have done a wonderful job introducing the public again to Hemingway. For a 6-hour presentation, I would say it's reasonably well balanced. I think that Lynn Novick needs to get an awful lot of credit because I think this was more her work than it was Ken Burns.
Yeah.
I first learned about the production underway back in 2016 when Lynn attended the International Hemingway meeting in Oak Park that year, and she told us about the project and what was coming, and people were very excited. I'm currently the director of the next International Hemingway Conference, which will be held next year in July, but it was supposed to be held in 2020. And Novick was going to come to our conference and show us some clips from the production that was underway and bring us up to date. Obviously, with COVID, that didn't happen. So it's been a long production sequence, and they've rounded up a good cast of people to talk to about Hemingway. I was particularly pleased to see that they talked to a number of writers, back to those words again.
Yes, yes.
I think that was helpful to hear what writers had to say. Most of what they had to say made a great deal of sense to me. Actually, at that same conference where Lynn Novick was present, Tim O'Brien was our keynote speaker. And he brought people almost to tears, talking about his own experience with war and the relationship that had to his reading in Hemingway and Hemingway's influence on him. Particularly on the things they carried, which has a lot going on it that's probably grew out of his reading of Hemingway's In Our Time. So I think they've done a good job. I think there's a potential problem with the good job they've done. maybe the too good a job they've done, because I think it's going to become the primary biography of Ernest Hemingway. Because it's easy, right? You sit down and in 6 hours, you've gone through it all, and it's not bad. It's darn good. But the best biography of Ernest Hemingway is 5 volumes. Mm-hmm. And they didn't get 5 volumes down on paper. That may attest to why we say he's such a complicated man. Michael Reynolds' 5-volume biography is a wonder. It's also delightful to read. Mike Reynolds is good with words. And you get in 5 volumes much more of the total complexity of the man. And so I will make some remarks about things that I guess would be the things left out. Hemingway was big on things left out. He practiced something called the iceberg theory. He said, if you really know something, you can leave it out of the work you're writing, and it will be there. It's an interesting theory. That's part of how he got to that pared down style of his. What can I leave out? What can I leave out? What can I leave out? And they talk about that matter sort of indirectly at the end of the series, when they're talking about the problem he had writing about his bullfight trip in 1959 in Spain. And he was asked to do 5,000 words for a magazine. He ended up writing 120,000 words, and he couldn't cut it. He had to have somebody else edit it. And that used to be one of his greatest strengths, being able to cut and edit. And when you see a man who is a master of that, unable to do it, and in 59, you know the trouble is there, and he's moving toward the end. But his theory of leaving things out is powerful. The sun also rises. The one thing left out, we all speculate about, is how was Jake Barnes wounded? Mm-hmm. We don't know. We're never told. That's left for us to put in. And that's sort of cool. And that's just one of many examples of a big thing left out. They talked about one of my favorite short stories, Hills Like White Elephants. And the one thing that's left out of that story is what it's about. It's about an abortion. The word does not appear anywhere in the story. But it's there. It's powerfully there. And that leads me, I guess, to a general thing I want to say about the production. I think that it was designed in part to redress a problem that Hemingway's reputation has had in the last 30 years. I remember sitting in an airport somewhere around, 1985 or so, with a colleague from another college, and she was explaining to me why she would not teach Ernest Hemingway, wouldn't touch it. As we started talking, I also realized she hadn't read much, but she'd bought into the notion that he was anti-woman, a total misogynist, and she was not about to expose her students to someone like that. And I think that what they were doing in part was a corrective to that through the whole of the 6 hours. I thought they did a very good job by raising up one of my favorite stories, Up in Michigan, a 1923 story. One of the stories that survived Hadley's loss of the manuscripts. And it's a date rape story. It's still the best one I've ever read. I taught it several times, and usually when I taught it, I had a husband and wife lawyer team come in, and we would divide the class up, and we would have a trial of the quote rapist. And they learned a lot about date rape, and the story is very sympathetic to the woman. Very. I mean, I dare anyone to say there's even a touch of misogyny in that story. It's quite the opposite. Very, very empathetic. So Hemingway, as the production says, he was androgynous. I think most writers have to be if they're writing fiction. You can't have a character, you can have a novel that's all male or a novel that's all female, but it's pretty hard to get deep into the world if you can't practice some kind of androgyny, at least when you're writing. Now, when you're living, you may be bad at it. You know? But when you're writing, that's a different matter. And so up in Michigan, he is very empathetic with young Liz Coates. And then in Hills of White Elephants, it's almost a drama. There's almost no descriptive material in it. It's a conversation between a man and a woman. And they're talking about this problem and what to do about it. And it's very clear the guy wants her to get an abortion. Her position is much more ambiguous. And Hemingway not only uses the word abortion in the story, he also doesn't tell us how it ends. We're left at the train station with the couple. We're not sure what she's going to do. Again, that's one of those wonderful things that allows us to be part of a story. A French literary critic said that there's two kinds of fiction. There's readerly fiction. In that kind of fiction, the writer tells you everything you need to know. And then there's writerly fiction where you have to jump in and do part of the writing. Yeah, and Hemingway's brilliant at that. In another story they talked about, and maybe it's my favorite story of all of Hemingway's marvelous short stories, Indian Camp. I often have students go through and put an X every time the little boy who's in the story says something that they don't agree with. And what they're doing is putting themselves into the story, and Hemingway knows that. And so at the end of the story, you've got a little boy who is happy as he can be after having gone through a horrible event. And the reader's sitting there, I'm not with you. I'm terrified. And yet you have to then, as a reader, come together around that. Well, now, where should I really be? Is the boy smarter than I am? Is his innocence something I should try to retrieve? What do I do with this horror in the world? Because the world has horror in it, and it also has that peace in it if you can find it. And that, I think, is at the heart of Hemingway's writing. He gets both of those things down. And they talk about that somewhat in the course of the 6 hours. And I'm glad they do. But I think they overemphasized Hemingway's negative experience in the world. And it's there. There's no doubt about it. He is very concerned about death. But I don't think he's any more concerned about death than he is about living. And I think that that's one of the things he did. He lived intensely. Maybe it burned him out. I don't know. He was a sensualist. I mean, the whole world came in through all 5 of the senses to him all the time. And one of the things that's marvelous about reading is because he's so good at bringing all the senses to play, I think he does accomplish what he says he wants to. He's often able to let you be where he is. The story is an experience. It's not something that you have to lean back and absorb. It's the other way around. You're being absorbed in an experience at that time. And it's a very powerful thing to have happen. It's hard to get that kind of writing. And he knew it. And he knew, and this is part of his problem as he grew over the years, he knew he was daggone good at it, and nobody else could imitate him. When they tried, it came out silly. And there are those that claim as he got older, he came out silly too, because he couldn't do it anymore. That was a charge that they leveled in the video about his 1950 novel, Across the River and Into the Trees. And it did get terrible, terrible reviews. What I thought they should have done was talk about people who have been rereading it a lot in the last 10 or 15 years and saying, wait a minute, you're mad at it because it doesn't read like Hemingway. Well, Hemingway changes. And in this one, if you want to think more about, let's say, Dante's Divine Comedy, and you want to think about Renata, not as a person, but as a guide to a new way of being. If you want to think about the Colonel, not as a man who fought in World War II, but as a man who's fighting the way of life, then it becomes a very readable book. Hemingway himself thought it was a pretty good book. And it really upset him that it got miserable reviews. So I think that the complexity of him is shown in the fact that if you read The Sun Also Rises, the first major novel, and then you just go from it to A Farewell to Arms, there's a big jump in style. Sun Also Rises is heavy in dialogue. It also has beautiful descriptive material. But they in Farewell to Arms, and they, one of the things I liked about the production is they showed you manuscript versions of things, and I've spent weeks at the Kennedy Library reading manuscripts. But when you read those opening manuscript pages of Farewell to Arms, that's one long paragraph. That's not short, choppy prose. It's absolutely beautiful poetry. And there are many stretches like that. A person did a word study of Fitzgerald and Hemingway probably 40 years ago. And it was a stylistic study. And the end result was there was no word count study difference between Fitzgerald and Hemingway.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I found that absolutely fascinating.
Oh.
But if you pay attention to Hemingway when he's maybe writing about nature or something, he gets absolutely lyrical. And so one of the problems, I think, is there are a lot of opinions out there about Ernest Hemingway by people who haven't read enough. Now, I can't say much. I started working with Hemingway as a scholar in 1968, so I've read a lot of Hemingway again and again and again. And most recently, I was working with The Old Man and the Sea. And I don't know how many times I've read that. And it says something about a writer if you've read it, I don't know, 40 times, and you can still read it again. It's still readable. And this is one of the charms of Hemingway. The book that I did on Old Man and the Sea is called Reading Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. And it's a book bigger than The Old Man and the Sea, and it's tri-authored. One of my dearest friends, Bickford Sylvester, had a contract to write that book, and his health failed, and it got worse and worse. And I was corresponding with him and answering questions as he was writing it. And another friend of ours, Peter Hayes, University of California, was doing the same thing. So as Bickford got more and more disabled, he asked us if we would finish the book. And so after he died, his widow provided us with a big box. It had more material in it than either one of us thought there was at that point. So we started to work on his work and finished the book. It's a line by line. The series, Reading Ernest Hemingway, I'll talk about it when I exit. I'll talk about bibliography. This book is a line by line reading of The Old Man and the Sea. Now, there are some lines we couldn't find anything to say anything about, but we literally went through line by line by line by line. And if there was some way that commentary was helpful, we wrote the commentary or we explained the term or whatever it was. And that's the way that whole series works. Very helpful for libraries. But Bick had this theory, and I think the whole series is based on this theory, that if Hemingway writes something, you better know what it is. If he tells you, and this is The Old Man and the Sea, there's the boy in it. He's always referred to as the boy. And I know in my readings of it for many times, I presume the boy, I don't know, 10 years old, maybe 12 years old. Well, Bick, in his careful reading of things, noticed that Hemingway gave us a complete description of the line with which the old man fished. Now, Bick was a deep sea fisherman himself, so he really cared about this stuff more than I would have. So he took the measurement of the line And Hemingway tells you what it is. He gives you the diameter. He tells you the length of line that there is. And he tells you precisely what kind of cord is used. So Bick goes and tests this out, and wet coming in from the sea, he estimates, well, calculates, I shouldn't say estimate, he calculates that it weighs about 150 pounds, which means no 10 or 12-year-old boy was carrying that in for the old man. And that redated things. And also, as we studied more and more with this, you're called a boy in Cuba until you marry. So it could well be that this boy is 18, 20, even 25. And so deep reading in Hemingway takes you to places that changes the story itself. There's nothing to be overlooked. He gives you a story in the Old Man and the Sea about a hand wrestling between the old man and a giant of a man, and it goes on and on and on for hours. Again, this is Bickford. He doesn't leave anything up in the air. So he got in touch with the International Hand Wrestling Association, and he found out that in real life, the longest hand wrestling had ever happened was something like 5 minutes, not hours. And so that shows you, Hemingway says to you, if you know this, you know I'm writing mythology here, right? I'm writing about a man who's mythologized himself, just like Hemingway did all the time. He mythologized himself, and they were good about pointing that out in the series. I mean, by the time Hemingway got to be 50 and was talking about World War I mean, he had won more medals than he could fit on a jacket and had more wounds than he had body. And he'd fought with the Italian army, which he never did. And so you need to know when people are mythologizing, and you can tell that in the stories. So I think that those are things that really have mattered, that Hemingway is a master of words because every darn word counts. And that's why he, like two of my other favorite writers, Alfred Hitchcock and William Shakespeare, were able to do something really hard. They were able to write at a level where, I mean, I don't know how many thousands and millions of pages have been written on Shakespeare. People write on and on and on. It's deep, it goes deeper and deeper, and nobody's gotten to the bottom. The same is true with Hitchcock's films. I used to teach film studies as well as American literature, and taught Hitchcock courses again and again. I've seen Psycho 100 times, I'm sure.
You wrote some crime too, didn't you?
What?
You wrote some crime yourself too?
No, I've written about crime fiction.
Okay. Okay.
Actually, I have one story, if it ever gets finished, that probably is a crime story. And part of the reason it is written is I'm not quite sure yet who did it, or if it was done. But I think that Shakespeare, Hemingway, and Hitchcock were all able to write so that the masses enjoy it. I mean, you can give The Old Man and the Sea to anybody, and they may not want to read it because they may not like fishing or whatever, but there's no problem with them reading. All the words there are accessible. The story is understandable at one level. You can also give it to me, and I can write line by line for it and write a book bigger than The Old Man and the Sea. And that's quite an accomplishment for people to be able to write for the masses and for the most studious of us all. Not many people achieve it. Yeah. I think an example is William Faulkner. I don't think, for the most part, you can give a Faulkner novel to a person on the street and have them get through it. It's not going to happen. And somebody Absalom, which is a beautiful book. But boy, the skills you have to read that. And most people don't possess them. And so Hemingway is one of those rare people. I think in American literature, the other person who did this was Mark Twain, for whom Hemingway had a special kinship. They quoted him in the video. In Green Hills of Africa, Hemingway says that all American literature starts from one book. Huckleberry Finn. And on that note, Twain and Hemingway have had the same problem, that is, with race and with language. I mean, Hemingway uses the N word. Mm-hmm. And they talked about that in the video. They had Mark Dudley, who's a really good scholar, talk about it. And Mark's probably done the best work on race in Hemingway. And yeah, the words are there. So what are you going to do about it? You can condemn him. You can do what they did in the series. They blacked the N word out every time they put up a manuscript, but it's there. And why is it there? Because it was there in 1925 or 1947, mm-hmm. And the writer is reflecting the time in which the writer lives, mm-hmm. And we need to know about those times. I'm tired of people saying we need to exit out. It didn't happen. Or my ears are too sensitive, I can't listen. No, we've got to listen because that's how we fix it. And so Hemingway, like Twain, had that problem. I think probably at a level, at least, Hemingway was racist. On the other hand, I got to know the man who was Hemingway's major domo, in charge of the house in Cuba. And Rene Virial is a Black Cuban. I interviewed him back in about 10 years ago. And I interviewed him at his son's home in New Jersey. And when I did the interview, I showed up at their house and I thought I'll be here an hour or two and I'll go home. No, I got there and there was a table spread with all kinds of Cuban hors d'oeuvres. And there were 2 bottles of wine on the table already. And 6 hours later, we had become friends. And I knew there was a book that I was looking at, not an interview. And I helped Rene and his son Raul get a publisher for the book. And the book's title is Papa's Cuban Son, a Black man. And Hemingway took care of that man's life so that after Hemingway was gone, this man was able to, one, stay on as the curator of the Hemingway home in Cuba for a long time under Castro, and then was able to come to the United States and live a comfortable middle-class life. I don't know whether you can see behind me, but there's a picture of Hemingway back there.
Yes.
That his son Raul is an artist, and Raul did that for me.
Is it a photograph or a black and white?
It's a black and white lithograph.
Lithograph, okay. It's beautiful.
It's a signed lithograph. It's #1. And next to it is a color piece. That's the front cover from my book, Hemingway, Cuba, and the Cuban Works. And that's Raul's also. He painted the cover for the book.
Nice.
And that's an original oil. So Hemingway was a part of a community that was mostly Black when he lived in Cuba. It was working class and it was Black. Now, some people have said, yeah, he lived there as Lord of the Manor. He's rich and he's powerful. I've talked to Raul, I've talked to Rene, I've talked to their brothers. That's not the way they saw it. They saw him as a generous man, a kind man, and a dear friend. And he also, Hemingway, this is a side of him that they didn't mention in the film, he enjoyed the cockfights in Cuba. He raised his own roosters. And he went to the cockfights. And he would go to the cockfights and he would sit with the people instead of the rich bettors. Mm-hmm. He was good friends with the high life players. These are, some of them were Basques, many of them were Afro-Cubans. And my essay in the book on the edited collection called Hemingway Cuba and the Cuban Works is an essay on Hemingway and Afro-Cuban religion. There are a lot of people that talk a lot about Hemingway and Catholicism, but that's not the end of the story. And this is
That's
something that
fascinating.
it is fascinating stuff. I gave you a copy at the library. Take a look at that essay.
I will.
It's intriguing. And I've been working on that and in things around it for maybe 15, 20 years now. And Hemingway and religion itself is a very interesting topic. Um, he grew up in a religious community, and that's always noted. I wrote a long essay on that for a book called Hemingway, The Oak Park Years. And Hemingway grew up in a community where his parents were fairly conservative. His pastor was not. His pastor would refer to Darwin, Nietzsche, people like that during a sermon.
Wow.
And I went to the trouble, this is what scholars do. I read the sermons, so I know. Um, but Hemingway, I think, was on what I call a religious odyssey. He sort of drifted from island to island, trying to find one that would support him fully. I don't think he ever did. But what he would do is take bits and pieces. Yeah, he had some Catholicism in him. He had some Protestantism in him of different kinds. He had some atheism in him, especially when he came back from World War II. What happened in the Hurtgen Forest, I think, was something he never got over. The slaughter was just too much. And then when he was living in Cuba, he got to see a kind of religion he'd never seen before. It's African in origin. It hides itself behind Catholicism. And once you know the way they're doing things, you can see that figures that you thought were Catholic are African goddesses or gods. And it's exciting. It gives you another way to read The Old Man and the Sea. So he's a complicated guy, a man who knew much more than most people do. He left 9,000 books in the library at the Finca, 9,000. Back in the 20s, there was a critic who called him a dumb ox. Yeah, a real dumb ox. He read and read. He was self-educated. He refused to go to college. His parents went to Oberlin, and they were very well-educated people. And they wanted him to do the same. But he just refused college and went off to Kansas City, as they tell us in the video, and got an education there, which was pretty darn good for a writer. And then after that, he read and he read and he read. Mike Reynolds, the biographer I mentioned, has done a good job of tracking down his reading while he was in Paris. Mike did, again, what scholars did. He went to Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris, and he got a hold of the old card catalog, the old card files of who checked out what when. And he made a list of every book that Hemingway checked out. And so we know what he read. Mike also went to Oak Park High School and dug out all of the syllabi for all of the English courses that he took at Oak Park. And Oak Park at that time, the education there, I would say, would match or maybe be better than most first-year college English educations in the United States today. Hemingway was well-read when he left high school. And Mike has all that in the list of things that Hemingway read in those early years. And then a couple of scholars from Canada went down to the Finca when they were allowed in and we weren't yet. And they cataloged the whole 9,000. And then they also, working with Reynolds, we have a catalog of all of the books that he left in Key West. And so we really know the kind of library he had. And I think one of the things that is hard to put into a video because it's dull and boring is that Hemingway spent a lot of time writing and reading. It's much more photographic to show him fishing and big game hunting or out drinking or whatever. But the man read in many different ways. He was considered one of the leading experts on the marlin in the Atlantic Ocean. He had a scholarly knowledge of that. I mean, ichthyologists came to talk to Hemingway because he kept careful log notes of the fishing and the habits of the fish. And he read about it and he knew about it. And they talked about that some in the course of things. He knew about things. That's part of what he meant. So you have to write about what you know. So if he has in Macomber, if he has them using a Mannlicher rifle, he's used one. He knows exactly what it does, how it kicks, what the calibers are, what kind of hole it makes. Now, he may not put all of that in, but he knows it. And if he knows it, it's there. You can trust it. Beautiful stuff that comes that way. So he was a well-educated man, although he was an autodidact. He was entirely self-taught. I remember once reading somebody who speculated on his Myers-Briggs profile, and they suggested he was an extrovert. He was not. Yeah. You cannot be a writer and an extrovert, I don't think, because writing is lonely, and writing is sitting there with nobody for a long period of time. And he had that discipline at least up until he came back from World War II. He could do that. He could write. He could get up early in the morning. Renee, the major domo, would greet him when he came out in the morning and have orange juice ready for him and bring his coffee. And Hemingway would start to work immediately. And he would work usually until about noon. He would really, one of the things he would say, he would work until he just didn't have any more good words. When he got to the point where he knew he was writing, he had to quit. And as a writer, I'm sure that's true. I'm more poet than I am fiction writer, although I've written some fiction. When you're writing fiction and you start to think for the characters, you better quit. You're supposed to be recording things from them, not writing for them. And so Hemingway would write as long as it's good. And usually that went nearly till noon. And then he stopped. And after that, as the boys, as Patrick said, that the kids enjoyed, he was there. And they would go do fun stuff. They would go skeet shooting, or they would get on the pilar and head out and fish, or they would do whatever. But he preserved those mornings for years. And what we begin to see, and this is a sad part of his life, is when we get to the 1940s, back from the war, he's not writing much. He's trying. He starts what would supposed to be the great war book. He was going to have a war book in 3 parts: the land part, the sea part, and the air part. The only thing he ever really got down on paper was the sea part, which eventually came out as Islands in the Stream as a posthumous piece. But he couldn't focus anymore. And as they noted, when he couldn't focus, then the problem got to be, what am I going to do because I can't focus? The answer is, I'll get drunk. And when I get drunk, I get mean. And poor Mary. I thought they gave maybe more attention than they needed to the marriages, but they are an important part of his life. And poor Mary steps in for the last 20 years of it, and she gets hell. I mean, he was losing it mentally. There's a book called Hemingway's Brain. Be a good thing to have in the library. It's a very interesting read. And the psychiatrist who writes it thinks that Hemingway is like a football player who's had too many knocks in the head. And he literally has brain deterioration going on. And if you count up the concussions we know about that were serious, he had 8.
Mhm.
And so that was causing trouble. You add that to the fact that he was indeed an alcoholic. He controlled he was a functional alcoholic for 20, 30 years. And in that period from the 40s on into the 50s, it just doesn't work anymore. He's an alcoholic who can get out of control. He's a mean drunk. Um, and it's interfering obviously with his writing. It's interfering with his marriage. A lot of bad things are going on. And I think it's sort of intriguing to see that in spite of all of that, about 1950, after he meets Adriana, the young Italian girl, she really does become a kind of muse, and something happens, and he can write for a little bit. And in 8 weeks, although I think the revisions takes longer than that, he does The Old Man and the Sea.
Mhm.
And I think it is a stellar picture of Hemingway himself. That is to say, a person lives in the midst of a lot of chaos. And the question is, how do you live in it? He wrote a collection of short stories in the 1930s called Winner Take Nothing. And that title could have been the title of The Old Man and the Sea. Winner Take Nothing. He caught the big fish. He comes back with the bones. The question isn't really, can you get out of life and bring the fish in? You can't. You're going to die. The question is, what do you do in it? How do you live in it? The old man finds joy in it. Yeah, the fish gets eaten by the sharks, but that's not because the sharks are evil. That would be a simplistic reading of an allegory. The sharks are sharks. That's what they are. And they eat marlins. And so things happen. It's just like we live in our bodies, they will betray us. The old man, though, at the end is happy. The last lines of the book, he's sleeping, dreaming of the lions on the beach. Now, some people think he'll never wake up from the dream. I don't know. It's another one of those things that
Another one
Hemingway
of
leaves
those
out.
Hemingway things.
Yeah. And so you can have it either way. I mean, he loves to end things open-ended like that. I mean, the end of The Sun Also Rises is, isn't it pretty to think so? How to inflect that line is open. Is it pretty to think so? Could be. Is that all irony? Oh God, isn't it pretty to think so? Well, you have to go back through and read and make a decision about it as a reader. And maybe you read it one time and decide it's one way, and another time you decide it's another. I know you asked me a question in writing the other day about me and when I got interested in Hemingway, and was I that way early on? The answer is definitely no. The first time I read Hemingway in college was The Sun Also Rises. It was assigned in an American Lit course, and I literally threw it out of my dorm window. Now, maybe that's because I was like Hemingway. I grew up in the Midwest. This was not my world. I thought these were a bunch of drunken jerks. And I picked it back up off the ground and finished my assignment as I was supposed to. I was sort of teased by my professor, who was a Hemingway scholar. And I didn't think any more about it, really, about Hemingway. But when I was doing my PhD, I was taking a course in the 1920s. And by then, my reading taste had gotten better. And as I was working on the collection called In Our Time, I became very intrigued in it as a kind of experiment in the novel. And I wrote an essay about that the professor really liked. And I really liked it. He really liked it. Darn it, it was good. It's in my first book as part of the book. And I'm proud of it. And so I was interested in Hemingway then for lots of reasons. But as you said in my introduction, I'm a theologian.
Yeah.
And not just a literary scholar. And my dissertation was going to be an examination of religious dimensions of secular writing. And so I wrote up my perspective, gave it to my advisor, and I thought it was pretty clever. I was going to do work with Hemingway and Fitzgerald and look at religious dimensions in that through a series of methods. And he leaned back in his chair after he read the perspectives and he said, Grimes, which the hell dissertation are you going to write? His point was, given the amount of scholarly work that had been done on both Fitzgerald and Hemingway, if I tried to do both of them, I'd still be writing my dissertation. And so after going home and thinking about it a bit, I came back and I said, I'm doing the Hemingway. And so that was 1969, 1970. And I started working on the dissertation. And when I finished it, I thought I was through with Hemingway. I taught a course on him 1 year. Every now and then I would teach one of the stories in a course I was teaching. And then in 1978, there was a conference on Hemingway being held at University of Alabama to look at something that I knew about but didn't really know a lot about. That is, say, Hemingway's papers. Hemingway was a pack rat. He kept everything. I've read shopping lists. Seriously, there's one good study of Hemingway's drinking habits based on the list of all the wine that and liquor that he bought through a period of time. He kept everything, which means he kept his manuscripts. And so I went down to the conference. That's the only time I ever met Mary Hemingway. She was at the conference and was explaining how she was going to get the papers given to the Kennedy Library in Massachusetts. And there were people who had seen some of the papers there talking about what they'd discovered, and I got interested again. And there was a conference in 1980 on Thompson Island, a little island in the harbor off the Boston coast, to celebrate the opening of the Kennedy Library's Hemingway collection. And I went to that, and it's during that time that we formed the Hemingway Society.
Okay, would you talk a little bit about that? Because I find it very intriguing.
Yeah, well, the Hemingway Society, it was a group of guys, and well, I'm mostly guys at that point. As you can see from the people that were in the video, that's changed a lot. It's not a bunch of old white guys anymore. It's young people, old people, white guys, colored people, women, lots and lots of excellent women scholars. And so we were sitting on the edge of the beach under a tree with planes coming in over our head, just a few feet above us, it felt like, because we were right under the landing pattern for Logan Airport. And so we're sitting there and talking about what might need to be done in the future. And one of the people, Paul Smith, said, well, we just need to get organized. And Paul was a doer. And he went to work on seeing how some other literary societies had been formed and came back with a proposal. And we all agreed to it before the week was over. And there we were. We were a society duly authorized to continue as such. We're probably, after the Shakespeare Society, the largest literary society in the United States. We're also one of the wealthiest. We have about $1 million in our foundation.
Wow.
I was treasurer of the foundation until I took over the role of directing this upcoming conference. So we can do things, and we
What
do.
kind of things do you do? Do you do scholarships?
We do scholarships. That's how we keep these young people coming to Hemingway.
Excellent.
We can help them. In other words, all of the graduate students, I suspect, that will want to come to the conference in 2022, all of them are coming to make a presentation. We will fund them. We'll at least give them enough money to cover their airfare. And that makes a big difference when you're a grad student.
It does.
We also have prizes. We are one of the major supporters of the Penn Hemingway Award. We contribute 15,000 a year to that. We use it to organize and run our conferences. Our last international conference was in Paris. And of course, the location doesn't hurt for attracting people. We had over 500 people at the conference. And I think most literary conferences are lucky if they have 100. But no, we're very active. And that leads me to something that happened a couple of months ago. One of my former students is now a graduate student at a very fine university. And he dropped a note to me about what I was doing now. And I'd sent a note back saying stuff that I was doing. And he sent back, but why are you doing this Hemingway thing? He's old and dead and irrelevant. And I knew then that he was at one of those graduate schools that has that group of faculty from the 70s and 80s that hated Hemingway. And so I said, well, Phil, it may be that you're right, except I want you to know this, that if Hemingway's irrelevant, why is it that the University of Cambridge Press has signed on to publish Hemingway's letters? There are 5 volumes out right now. There are 2 forthcoming, and there will be 17. By the way, he's a letter writer as good as he is a fiction writer, and they're fun to read. Some of them are downright funny. Some of them are so mean and cruel, I can't believe it. But he was obviously, if we got 17 volumes, he wrote a lot of letters. And so I said, we got the Letters Project. And then I told him about the PBS special coming up. And then I told him about the conference and the size of the last one was in Paris. And then I said, now, Phil, can you give me another writer who's doing as well? And he couldn't. I think there are only 2 writers in America whose pictures you could show around a mall and have anyone identify them. Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway. Now, a lot of people can't identify anybody, but those 2 are about the only ones. I mean, if you showed a picture of Melville or Hawthorne, I don't think. Emily Dickinson, maybe for some people. And I think more recently, maybe people that have been writing in the last 30 or 40 years, like Toni Morrison, people might recognize her. But as far as the writers that are gone, those are the 2. People wouldn't recognize Faulkner, wouldn't recognize Fitzgerald. So Hemingway's still out there and doing well. And I think ultimately it's because of the power of the writing itself.
It's interesting. I was talking to Lee, our director, about this, about Hemingway, and I haven't read a lot of Hemingway. I am vowing to read more because now I'm more interested. But he said, the thing I like about him the most is that he's real.
Yeah, I think that's what he's after. He wants to write. Well, he says in Death in the Afternoon, where he talks about writing a lot, that his goal is to produce the real thing. Yeah. And he said that you have to do that. You have to get the exact amount of emotion with the exact facts lined up perfectly.
Yes,
and then the real thing. Eliot called that the objective correlative. And it's hard to do. We read a lot of people who the emotions are there, but you can't believe them.
Yeah.
Because they're not fact.
Yeah.
And other people who bore you to death with the facts, but there's no emotion there. You don't care.
Yeah.
But it's an amazing trick, and he does it. He does it again and again. I think ultimately his short stories are his very best thing. If you haven't read much, read Indian Camp. It's 4 pages long.
Really?
Or maybe it's 8 pages long. Because he had a first part of it, back to the iceberg theory. He wrote about 4 pages before the characters get to the Indian camp. he went back and put an X through those 4 pages and started with the Indian camp.
I
And since he
see.
kept everything, we can see what he had started with and where it goes and what was left out. And that's true often with manuscripts. You can see what he left out.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's something big, like half the story.
Yeah.
Or he sometimes will really struggle with an ending. I had the privilege of a couple of years ago when I was working on the conference that's coming up, and I was in Sheridan, Wyoming, and we went up into the Bighorn Mountains to the cabin where he finished writing A Farewell to Arms. And it's just like they left it, hadn't done anything to it. I sat at the desk
Wow.
where it was magic. I sat at the desk where he struggled with the ending. He actually wrote out about a dozen endings and then picked the one that he finally thought was best. And what he was teaching us, I think, is that you have to keep rereading a work until you know what actually is the most likely thing to come out of it, because you know there could be several.
Mhm.
And so he reads through until he figures it out. He also had about 40 titles for that. And
Wow.
you can see he marked them all out and came up with A Farewell to Arms. Um, and so he's a very conscious writer, and that makes the stuff um, dense. I
Mhm.
mean, if you're picking every word because you want it to have 4 meanings, then the reader better take the time to figure out what at least 3 of them are.
Mhm.
Um, but Indian Camp is if you haven't read much, and they sort of gave you a couple of some clues. They didn't treat the short fiction as well as I wish they had, but they have time restraints. Indian Camp is marvelous. In that same collection, Big Two-Hearted River is one of my favorites. Soldier's Home, about a returning veteran who can't settle in, is powerful. And Hills Like White Elephants, Up in Michigan, Now I Lay Me, Light of the World. It goes on and on. There are at least 20 just incredible pieces of short fiction. Snows of Kilimanjaro, Short Happy Life of Francis McComber, is marvelous.
Mhm. Well, I'm hoping that reaching out to our community today gives them a better understanding of what Hemingway was all about. I know it has for me. Um, I've loved listening to you, and you threw in some things that weren't in the film. So thank you, Dr. James.
Well, I would like to end by suggesting some things by way of bibliography.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Uh, First of all, biography. Um, there's one good single volume biography, and it's the first one by Carlos Baker. And I know you have a copy because I gave you one. As I mentioned before, the great biography is Michael Reynolds' 5-volume biography. And he's a master of prose. You just find it so easy to read through, even if it's 5 volumes.
Mhm.
I gave you the last volume. And that's where people have a lot of questions. What was going on? How did that finally end? Mike does as good a job as we can with that. I mentioned the Letters Project. And Sandy Spanier at Penn State is the editor of that. There are 5 volumes of the letters available now. The next 2 out, I think, will be out next year. It could be another year after that because those are always tricky things.
Mhm.
Uh, will be well into the 1930s by the time those come out. By the time the 6th one comes out, the other one coming out is the last one. It's volume 17. And it's sort of interesting that they decided to bump that up. I was surprised in the documentary about one person they didn't include. They didn't include Hillary Hemingway. I don't know why. Maybe she didn't want to deal with him. She's a cantankerous, wonderful, funny lady, but she usually likes to talk. Hillary was married to Gregory, the youngest son, the one who killed himself. she's alive and well, and she was Hemingway's secretary from 1959 until his death. And then she worked with Mary to put the papers together. So I was really surprised they didn't
No
talk
mention.
to Hillary. No mention, and she wasn't listed in the credits at all. So now it may be. I mean, there's that family is full of lots of tensions. Hemingway wrote his sons out of his will. They got nothing, and you could sense some bitterness from Patrick. He's the only surviving son. What they did get, thanks to Mary, was the rights to all of the papers and manuscripts. And so they sometimes, I think sometimes things can go a little bit haywire with relationships. I know they have with scholars, but Hillary wasn't mentioned, and I think that's a shame, because the reason they're doing the last volume now is so Hillary can help edit it. She was there at the end. She was there with Mary. So among the living people other than Patrick who can tell us something direct, it's Hillary.
It's Hillary.
And while I didn't know Mary or the sons, I know Hillary. We've had good dinners together, and fascinating stuff she can tell. I would also like to raise up for people the series that I talked about, that My Old Man and the Sea book is in, the Readers Reading Hemingway series. It's published by Kent State University Press. And these are all line by lines. I think they're particularly useful for libraries because somebody can check it out of the library and read the book. And when they're stuck, by gosh, you probably got an answer right there in front of you. And if you don't, they should write one of us, whoever edited the book, and
get one.
answer, right? So those are things I think that people might want to know. But the most recent biographies, I don't think are as good as Baker.
As good as
Carlos Baker's original.
Baker. Okay.
So if a person wants to do one, I mean, you can get a used copy of Carlos Baker. It'll be cheaper than the newest ones and more reliable.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. Just a wealth of information, and I really appreciate you as a resource, and the library thanks you. I thank you for your generosity to us in both the books that you've given us and the time that you've given us today.
Well, my pleasure. Wish we had time to talk about the fiction.
Maybe another time.
Sounds like a good idea.
Thank you, Larry.